Keith Knight, welcome to the Carl Menger Institute podcast.
Matt, thank you so much for having me, brother.
Yes.
I appreciate you guys focusing primarily on the true method of economics, the logical deduction of Austrian economics.
Yes. I saw recently you put out a beautiful 3-hour YouTube video on 64 problems with democratic socialism. How did you create this video?
So, first of all, don't slander me. It was actually 4 hours. It's 3 hours and 58 minutes. I titled it 64 Arguments Against Democratic Socialism. My thinking was, if I were to have a conversation with someone like Hassan Piker or one of the members of his audience, what arguments are they not really familiar with? They've heard, socialism's bad, look at the Soviet Union. They've heard, how could Hassan Piker advocate socialism? He's so rich. Those don't really stick with people. I wanted to come up with a list of arguments that were both principled and empirical and personal in order to really advocate for the philosophy of voluntarism or libertarianism. So the definitions I use: communism is the abolition of private property, because if you don't agree on the definitions, it's hard to really agree on anything because you could be critiquing different things. Communism by Karl Marx was defined as the abolition of private property and the abolition of the freedom to contract. Socialism is the institutionalized aggression against private property and contractual exchanges. Capitalism, I'm defining as the institutionalized recognition of private property and non-aggressive contractual exchanges between private property owners. So I came up with the idea, because Mamdani is the mayor of New York City, probably the most famous town in America, it's gaining a lot of traction, and these are a lot of arguments that you could make it through a degree in economics at any university and be completely unfamiliar with any of them.
Yeah. Okay. You got me thinking now about Hassan Piker. Why is he so popular with the younger generations?
Why is Hassan Piker? Well, Hassan Piker's very good looking, and that matters more so in marketing than damn near anything else. I think his capacity to relentlessly create a villain that people can hate is vitally important. So it's very difficult to get someone advocating personal responsibility or get them into philosophy, but by creating a dichotomy, the rich are bad, you're not a member of the rich, here's why you should not like them. That could be an explanation. Looks plus ability to find an enemy. That could explain it. But then again, I could be totally wrong on that. Doesn't mean I'm wrong about democratic socialism. But as far as, if I really knew how he became so popular, I think I'd just copy it and become popular myself. So maybe that's why people are just so sick of hearing Democrats and Republicans say very similar things, or if they say things that are different, it's very difficult to distinguish between Bush and Obama and Biden and Trump when it comes to policies. So because he's advocating something radically different, people look at a situation and say, you know, whatever this is, I'm sick of the discussions about other countries. I'm sick of Democrats and Republicans justifying mass surveillance. I'm sick of Democrats and Republicans justifying mass murder under the guise of foreign policy. I need something not a little different, totally different. And then they'll look at Hassan Piker and say, well, that's totally different. So that could be an explanation. I'm not totally sure, though. As I said, if I really knew, I'd just copy him and become popular myself.
Yeah, he definitely has charisma, and I think the pressures facing the younger people, they're heading towards radical socialism or radical capitalism, if you will. Mm-hmm. Let me ask you, your time making a name for yourself, content, you've probably faced some backlash, and this is more of a personal question, but when someone's confronted with so much negativity and criticism from socialists, pretty much mostly online, how was your experience with that, and how did that affect you, if at all?
So you eventually just develop a large-scale tolerance to it. So when I get called a racist or a sexist or a useful idiot for the 1%, my just follow-up is, what evidence do you have to support that claim? Or if I am such a thing, what's wrong with racism or capitalism or being a dupe of the 1%? I always try to invoke a discussion on top of it. not letting it get to me. It's not even that I have to really try, but I was called a racist, a sexist, a terrorist sympathizer for so long by both Democrats and Republicans. It doesn't really bug me as much. I just know that I'm dealing with someone who is so heavily propagandized that my initial response is no longer, I'm really mad at you. It's, what a poor soul. It's quite literally a subhuman way of existence to just respond with words without having any justification. I'm like, okay, I'm a racist. What is racism? Which one of my actions has constituted me to be a racist? So asking them to explain themselves, the person coming up with that accusation is usually not the same person who has a well-developed philosophy regarding race. So the recent one I dealt with is, I saw an example of Keith Knight using a word that is very discriminatory. And I said, well, Nicki Minaj has said this word in one of her most famous songs. Is that something you would, say, she shouldn't be allowed in polite society? And she goes, well, no, Nicki Minaj is black, so that's okay. And I said, all right. So you explicitly treat people differently based on their race. I agree that one of us is a racist. I don't treat people differently based on their skin color. You explicitly do according to you. Which one of us is the actual racist? How much time have you spent thinking about this concept? Racism, sexism, terrorist sympathizer, Putin lover, Xi Jinping lover. These are some accusations that for some reason or another, it's been popular to make these claims without any sort of evidence. And it would be weird to say, that guy's a bank robber. What evidence do you have? I just suspect he is. Well, where did it ever become justifiable to throw out an accusation without any sort of evidence? So the lack of evidence they have is just really encouraging. And I think that's what, that plus the amount of times I've been called something without any justification backing it up doesn't bug me anymore.
That's interesting. It's making me think that, making an accusation without any justification is almost a phenomenon of a democratic society, where you can vote on something without being knowledgeable about what you're voting on. But I think that's kind of a side note. So we're here at Freedom Fest 2026 in Las Vegas, the Caesars Forum. And I kind of didn't give you much of an introduction, but you work with the Libertarian Institute. You have your show, Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Me.
No, don't tread on anyone.
Don't tread on anyone.
Yes.
My apologies. And we also have some of your books here. If I can ask you how these books came into existence.
So the Voluntarist Handbook, I was looking at all of the textbooks that I came across in college and high school, and I'm like, this is just absolute Keynesian nonsense. Economy grows when the government spends money. Do you think the problem in the year 500 AD was there wasn't a government to increase the amount of currency, or was it a problem of production, the incentive problem, and redistribution of goods and services through the concept of voluntary exchange? The voluntary redistribution is actually how wealth grows, especially through the concept of exchange and capital investment. So I was just complaining about it, and I just hated it, and I go, you know what? Time to do something about it. So I said, what can I do? And writing my own work, that was a little difficult. I think I was probably 26 or so, and I was kicked out of colleges, so I never graduated. And I thought, why don't I put together a compilation of my favorite topics on economics? So these are quotes from books, essays, articles, pamphlets that I've come across. Why don't I put those all in one book, make it a textbook, and make it freely available to anyone, anywhere? So if you go to libertarianinstitute.org, you can get a free copy of the Voluntarist Handbook, or you could purchase a physical copy on Amazon. I thought this would be the best way to compete with the socialist narrative that government is not only necessary, but beneficial. More government is going to result in economic growth and our capacity to cooperate. Those narratives are completely fictitious. So instead of complaining about it, I wanted to put together the 50 things that I read that took me from being a Democrat to being a libertarian. So that's what the Voluntarist Handbook is. And in the introduction and the epilogue, I summarize the entire book. So that's only, I believe, 5 pages in total.
You also have it dedicated to Edward Stringham. He's going to be teaching at our upcoming Anarchic Order program, and I'm curious why you chose to dedicate it to Edward Stringham.
One of the great contradictions in economics is the average economist will say monopolies are really bad. If there were a monopoly on televisions or books or clothes, what would happen is that organization would have so much institutional power, they would provide very high prices and very low quality because they wouldn't face competition. Edward Stringham, motivated by Gustave de Molinari in 1848, Edward Stringham says, I totally agree with that. Let's take that concept and apply it to a service. And the service is protection of persons and property. So he published a book titled Private Governance. He also published a book titled Anarchy and the Law. So something that we see as the state's primary focus, protect and defend persons and property. Edward Stringham says, well, this is a service just like any other thing we want in life. And also, if you look at governments, they routinely engage in mass murder operations under the guise of foreign policy. And every year they violate 20, 30, 40% of our property rights with income taxes and sales taxes and property taxes. And they regulate our property in completely unjust manners. So could it be that government not only isn't a good monopolist, but it could be that the government takes more as an expropriating property protector than they actually protect? So he took this concept that most people agree with and then just extended it to the realm of protections of persons and property. So Stringham discusses the philosophy of this idea, but then Stringham does something that was just so incredible. He says, look at the amount of property protection we have today. You have access to knives and guns, but that's sort of like a primitive way. Even if I use a gun, I would still contact my local police and say, here's what happened, I had to defend myself. So those are initial ways that we protect our property. But what about the property that we care about more so than anything else? What's in our bank account? Those are mostly done with private protection agencies that banks use. Banks have their own metrics for what constitutes cybersecurity. So our most valuable assets are actually protected not with the government, but with the private sector. Now, is this because banks are just so kind and generous and care about the public good? It could be, but a much better explanation is banks want your money, and they know you as a customer could go to a different bank. So if they don't provide me a good level of protection, if they develop a bad reputation, I'm not going to trust them with my money. So our most valuable assets we trust with private security. I worked at a private security firm. This was a tech company. And we would have, it was basically a call desk, so we had a number of clients, and they would call us, hey, my Microsoft Excel isn't working. That was usually it. But one time someone called and said, all of our company files have been completely encrypted, and someone in Indonesia is telling us we need to send them 500 grand and then they'll release our files. So they contacted us, a private company, and we were, as a customer of ours, we had planned for something like this. We had everything backed up. We said, tell the scammer to go play in the traffic. We have all your stuff taken care of. Give us about 24 hours and it'll be all set. Now, once I went to the company in person, this was in Phoenix, Arizona, I had said, so every one of the files that you guys have in your company was completely encrypted and basically stolen from you. Did you guys call 911? I mean, I know you called us and you said this just happened. Why didn't you call the police? I mean, these people broke the law. The law is protected by the police. We're not a government agency. Why did you call us? And they had said, oh, you know what? I think our chief executive officer is going to contact either the police or a private detective, but we know you guys had backed up the information. So in reality, not just in theory, people will use private voluntary agencies to provide the service of protecting their person and property when it's the most vulnerable aspects of their asset portfolio. So Edward Stringham uses the example of Facebook, Amazon, PayPal, Venmo, all of these. If I have access to your Facebook account, I could I could do some damage. I could get access to your phone number, your address, your location, whatever. All of those are privately protected. So Edward Stringham's ability to say the core service the state provides as a coercively funded monopoly would be better provided through voluntary competition, in theory, and there's real-world examples of this. PayPal, Venmo, the password you use to get into your Mac, laptop, all of those are examples of private protection in the real world today. We don't need to theorize about it. We can actually experience it. So that's why that was dedicated to Ed Stringham.
Beautiful. Let's talk a little bit about foreign policy. So the Libertarian Institute, founded by Scott Horton, phenomenal analyst on foreign policy. The state, another attribute of anarchy, is that without taxation and the ability to spend more than what your citizenry would actually want, is the nature of waging aggressive warfare, of territorial expansion. And I think if we had an anarchist society, we wouldn't be concerned about waging wars across the world because we would be more connected to the people around the world. So I would just like to discuss a little bit about, I don't know, what you think about foreign policy, perhaps.
So let me give a general Austrian view of foreign policy. When human beings act, they attempt to exceed their profits, whether it's monetary profit, resource profit, or psychic profit, as Mises discusses. And they tend to really avoid losses, monetary losses, psychic losses. They're constantly looking to improve their well-being and decrease the amount of inconveniences that they have. In seeking profit, they can do this one of two ways, or a few ways. They could homestead property, mix their labor with unowned resources. They could exchange for other people's property by engaging in a contract with an employer, using resources they've gained, and then contracting. They could increase their resources that way. Or they could engage in the statist or socialist means of either stealing directly, conspiring with others to steal or commit fraud, or use the political legitimacy of the state apparatus to acquire resources at the expense of others. What governments do is by giving you access to a tax base, it lowers the cost of aggression. So it does it two ways. By giving you access to a tax base, I no longer have to take out of funds that I first have to acquire to then go steal the resources from you. I have access to the involuntary tax base of consumers. So through the Austrian lens, we could see that by drastically lowering the cost of aggression, it is much more likely that you would engage in acts of aggression. That's why it's no coincidence that the biggest murderers of all time are all states and governments going to war against one another. You would think the opposite, because remember, the public sector is for the public. They care about the collective. The private sector is evil, greedy, dog-eat-dog, externalities, exploitation. We would think there's basically no wars with governments, but all the big wars are in the private sector. Walmart killing Amazon employees, going to war, forming an alliance with Home Depot. That doesn't happen at all. One way to think about that is, well, governments are protecting us. Another way is, when people have to bear the cost of their aggression, they're much less likely to engage in it. The second aspect is the halo of legitimacy that the state grants itself. People assume that violence isn't violence when this organization called government does it. So this double standard could be the result of governments having control over compulsory education. Not all education, but the aspect of compulsory education. The Catholic Church could never engage in, legally, what the government routinely engages in. So both the psychological approach that the citizenry says, murder isn't really murder when the government does it, that's foreign policy, it's for the greater good, they're allowed to do it. That plus diminishing the cost of engaging in aggression with central banks and with access to a tax base, that makes wars much more likely to occur than they otherwise would. So as far as democratic socialists, who a lot of times are with us on these issues of opposing the American regime engaging in unjustifiable imperialism, I actually wonder if they would oppose the North imperialism of the South and from 1861 to 65, or, Lenin and Stalin's invasion of Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Romania, Poland, East Germany, Yugoslavia. Okay, at least when it comes to the American government, they're against that sort of imperialism. To say that, well, I'm pro-government, but I'm anti-war, is sort of like saying I support giving the 16-year-old Jack Daniels, I support giving him the house to himself, I support giving him keys to the car, I support him driving the car, and I support him driving the car 90 miles an hour down the freeway. It's like, well, once you give them that much power, it's so dangerous, you can't avoid the inevitable crash. So if you give government the power to tax, the power to have a central bank, the capacity to conscript, what we call the selective service, which Pete Hegseth now made automatically mandatory, if you give governments the capacity to regulate economies, if you give them the right to declare war on other countries, are you really going to be surprised once you've given them all these 5 things that, they didn't just use it to give us health care and give us education? What are the chances? This is something we should absolutely expect. So the fallacious thinking comes in when they say, well, the American empire is terrible, we should be more like Norway. Well, a better comparison is the American empire versus Genghis Khan's empire, Kaiser Wilhelm's empire, Stalin's empire, Hitler's empire, the British Empire, the French Empire, Tsar Nicholas's empire. So if we see this pattern again and again and again, we see that governments are much more destructive to the life of the average member of the working class than any private organization. And Austrian Economics has the answer for us. Because people don't have to bear the cost of their actions, the costs are diverted to the taxpayer and with a central bank. These things are much more likely to exist. So that is our general overview on war. This is something that could apply to any person, any society, at any time. The specifics, of course, can change, but the praxeological fundamentals of how human beings operate in a self-interested manner through the process of exchange is what we focus on at the Libertarian Institute.
Beautiful. Well said. I want to ask you too, because we just had the 250th anniversary of the United States. It's currently July 9th, if I'm not mistaken. And the cost of these wars are not just lives elsewhere, but it's also, there's a price of freedom domestically. And to kind of segue into asking you how this book came about, Domestic Imperialism, well, what's going on? Are we actually free, or are we delusional in what we think freedom is in this country?
Well, it would certainly depend on whoever's making the claim, and I would ask them what they define as freedom. I would say that freedom is the capacity for human beings to engage in social cooperation as opposed to using the methods of violence, coercion, or fraud. Should probably narrow down that definition. But in short, it's not doing whatever you want, as some people unjustifiably describe freedom as. Because if I'm alone on an island, Robinson Crusoe, the concept of freedom doesn't really come up. Because, yeah, I can do whatever I want. Am I violating the rights of the sand or the shells or the trees or the ocean? The concept of freedom only comes into importance once someone else shows up on the island, and it's how these human beings interact with each other. So freedom necessarily implies social, voluntary cooperation. That's what freedom is. A lot of people will see, if they can't see it clearly with their own government, they'll clearly say that, look, when one country invades another and confiscates their territory or makes threats, do this or we're going to take your land, that's imperialism, that's coercion, that's totally unjustifiable. The problem is the US government does this to its domestic population all the time. So imagine if we said to the Iranian government, give us 40% of Iran or we're going to use violence. We're not going to be specific, but we'll make sure that it happens. Well, we would clearly see that as imperialism. You are threatening other people unless they give you a portion of their property. Well, that's what the income tax is. That's what sales tax is. Hey, Matt, anytime you make an exchange, give the Libertarian Institute 1%, or we're going to use some methods of violence against you. And we're doing great things at the Institute, so you're actually promoting the greater good when we do that. That is, in principle, no difference than what the government does when it comes to foreign policy. So for the same reason, people on the left rightly oppose sanctions imposed on people of Cuba or Iraq or Iran or the Caesar sanctions for the people in Syria, which were absolutely devastating. Those sanctions are basically saying the U.S. government will use violence to restrict economic activity between human beings. That's what the government does domestically routinely. So all we need to do is take the principles that we apply to each other, the importance of self-ownership, freedom of contract, and extend those consistently to people who occupy the state apparatus. So that's what domestic imperialism is. It's basically seeing the state as attempting to use the method of imperialism domestically and benefiting itself that way, instead of, it's not really looking to take over portions and have military bases there. They've taken bases away from places like Kabul, to my surprise, actually. So the way the state is currently benefiting is primarily through the method of domestic imperialism, using threats against the domestic population, saying that if the domestic population doesn't accept regulations or the domestic population doesn't surrender a portion of their property, the state will threaten violence against you. It's wrong to do to Cubans, Iraqis, Iranians, Chinamen, Russians, and Americans as well. So that is the general thesis of the book, and I go through the 9 things that made me a progressive that I later switched to becoming a libertarian on.
Are you currently working on another book?
Yeah, I am trying to make the case that the Second World War is not an exception when it comes to wars that are unjustifiable. So the average view of the Second World War is that it was necessary for the United States and Britain to protect their own civilization by the British Empire declaring war against Germany first in August 2nd of 1914, and then again September 3rd of 1939, along with the French Empire. And then the second aspect that I'm looking at is, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys? Whenever this question is discussed, the average person will have the characters in their head and say, Germany, France, Russia, Great Britain, China, Japan, America, who are the good guys and the bad guys, and focus on which countries should I put in that category. My thesis in whatever my upcoming book tends to be is that the bad guys are the politicians of each country. Those are the literal parasites amongst the productive members of society, who are the civilian populations of each country. If we just look at the worst case of mass murder probably in our entire lives would either be the Japanese invasion of China or Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union. If you look at what his justifications were, totally immoral. He could have negotiated. Basically, he thought that the British Empire was not accepting his peace offer of July 19th, 1940, because they were waiting for the Soviets to come in. He said, well, the Soviets violated the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact by invading Romania close to our borders. So what we're going to do is basically declare war against the Soviet Union, and then they invaded. Now compare where Germany is and where the Soviet Union is, and both of these empires are expanding in one direction. One thing to look at is these great enemies of freedom are going to fight each other, so we could stay out. A much more interesting aspect is to say, look at the American government's justification for going to war in Korea and Vietnam and Afghanistan and Libya and Syria and Iraq and Iran and Yemen. If those are potentially violating our freedoms, or Joe Biden's explicit claim that the U.S. would defend Taiwan against a Chinese invasion, if our security concerns extend thousands of miles in every direction of the globe, well then the Germany's security concerns in July 22nd of 1941, those were much more threatened by the Soviet expansive empire, who was explicitly dedicated to the idea of Comintern. This is Communist International. Communism everywhere, abolish all current governments. Well, if we're going to say Hitler was unjustified, which I think we absolutely should, let's also apply that standard consistently and say the U.S. government is completely lying when they're saying we have a security concern, so we're going to justify mass murder. So that is my current project, that the Second World War is a fallacious attempt by a lot of media pundits to justify wars in the present. What they essentially do is say, look, it is so difficult and complex, it takes so much time, the opportunity cost is so high to get informed on current events. So what you should do is refer to historical narratives or general interpretations of past events. And then that's how you decide what to do in the present. So, Roosevelt had the New Deal to fix the economy. We should have a New Deal here. Call it the Green New Deal or the stimulus package. Franklin Roosevelt also fought Hitler. Hitler was a big bad guy in charge of a big country. That's sort of like, Putin today or Xi Jinping. So therefore, for the same reason you would oppose going to, for the same reason we should oppose Hitler, we opposed Hitler then, we should oppose Putin and Xi Jinping now. So the adherence to these historical narratives is so important. That's why I'm focusing on the Second World War, because it's used in the present as a justification for all the unjustifiable crimes we see in the present.
Yeah, wow, that's fantastic. That's really enlightening too. I think it portrays a lot of this psychological justification, like you were saying, against Putin or Xi Jinping or Osama or Saddam or anyone, even Trump, domestically. This guy's literally Hitler. So we can therefore justify anything to combat this.
Exactly, and look who Trump talks to. Trump talks to probably the greatest threat to freedom, maybe in the world, maybe in America. Zoran Mamdani, the mayor of New York City, he had him over at the White House and was shaking hands and getting along with him. It's like, look, I don't love that. I wish there'd be a regime change in New York. But if you can talk with him, well, then of course you could talk with Vladimir Putin. Of course you could talk with Xi Jinping. The U.S. government is friends with, I forget the guy's name. I think originally it was Abu Muhammad al-Jilani, and now he changed his name to Ahmed al-Sharaa. This is literally an al-Qaeda fighter in Iraq who is now the president of Syria. And they're friends with him. He actually came to the White House as well. U.S. is friends with Mohammed bin Salman, the psychopathic murderer in Saudi Arabia. Is it my first choice? No. But hey, it's a hell of a lot better than saying, these people can't be negotiated with, we need to declare war on them. For the same reason, we could be friends with Mohammed bin Salman. We, of course, can be friends with Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. John F. Kennedy was exchanging letters with the head of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, to de-escalate the Cuban Missile Crisis. Dwight Eisenhower invited Nikita Khrushchev to America in 1959 to tour the country for 10 days. Richard Nixon famously shook hands with Chairman Mao. Of course we could be friends with these people. Nothing inconsistent about that while advocating the philosophy of freedom, because the alternative is saying, well, no, they're evil, and therefore the only way to approach them is to start bombing and potentially nuking and blockading their areas. One of the great contradictions in foreign policy is, there's a potential that if Putin takes the Donbass, he'll then take Ukraine and then Eastern Europe, then Western Europe, then South America, then Mexico, then America. Okay. So if the most amazing conquering of all time happens, then maybe our freedoms will be threatened, hypothetically. But what about the real world violations of our freedom that happen every day from our domestic government? If it is justifiable to respond to hypothetical violations of our independence and hypothetical violations of our freedom, well then how do you expect us to react with regards to the federal government? Yeah. There was a funny SNL skit where the guy playing Donald Trump comes out and says, we killed the Ayatollah, he was a terrible leader, his people hated him, so we killed him, but don't get any ideas. And it was just so funny because it's like, all the things you say about these foreign leaders apply to you tenfold, so why don't you just be careful? Because I don't want things to escalate at all. I just wish everyone would say, oh yeah, the Keynesians are totally wrong, the Austrians are right. Ed Stringham is totally right. Let's just privatize everything. That's all I want. So, that's another huge contradiction. They say if our freedoms are hypothetically, maybe in the future violated, we have to use violence. But when they're violated every day by our domestic governments, well, in 4 years we'll vote between two lying politicians, so that'll fix it.
So let's talk a little bit about this escalation, because this is something I'm curious about and also concerned about. Recently, and this is from what I heard of a friend of the podcast, Thaddeus Russell, that the U.S., Trump is gonna sell 6 F-36s, fighter jets, F-35, 36, to Turkey. And Turkey, also within NATO, is considered one of the biggest threats I believe, to Israel. At the same time, I believe Israel, or actually Iran, the IRGC, is predicting that after the elections in November, there's going to be a large attack from Israel and the US, just after they get through the elections. And that's kind of what I think they said they're preparing for.
You know what? I don't have any specific knowledge. I know that the former Prime Minister of Israel, Naftali Bennett, right after the U.S. launched the operation alongside Israel in Iran, Bennett comes out and says, there's also a Turkish threat newly emerging, and Erdogan is at the head of this threat. So you give them one war and they just start thinking about the next one. That's what happens when you don't have to bear the cost of waging these wars of aggression. It's also a great detriment to the domestic population when our politicians are terribly worried about a foreign country. Maybe they're not even worried, they just use it as an example. I know Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State for America during the Second World War, and Secretary of War Henry Stimson had both said, well, you know, we'd like to negotiate with China, but we couldn't do that to our China. We'd like to negotiate with Japan, but we just couldn't throw our Chinese counterparts under the bus. So maybe it's something they want to do, and they're just saying, "Oh, we're doing it for Israel." I'm not really sure, but I know Naftali Bennett has explicitly said, "Yeah, Turkey's next." I know Mark Levin, which sounds like a joke. Well, what Mark Levin wants is, but the sitting president, Trump, has said, everyone watch Mark Levin's show tonight. And then Mark Levin has literally put his arm around President Trump. So I think Levin has maybe some sway, or maybe there's just so much overlap that he might as well have sway. I'm not exactly sure. But when it's something like that, all I can do is try to promote peace, freedom, and increase the amount of skepticism people have of the current regime by exposing the lies of previous wars and exposing the high cost of going into war for foreign and domestic populations. I don't have these specifics on whether or not things will escalate with Turkey, but unfortunately, would have been September 9th of 2025, I believe the Israeli government bombed Qatar during peace negotiations. So if the Iranian government is skeptical of the U.S. government, you know, saying, oh yeah, we'll have peace now, they might think, well, Trump's only doing this because his war is unpopular and he has an election coming up in November. Not for him, but his party is up for congressional seats. They could very well think that, and we have no one to blame except the people who claim to represent us. This is another important aspect. I was having a debate earlier, and I was accused of saying, well, no matter what happens, you pin everything on the U.S. government, either provoking a conflict or staying out of it or backing one side and not supporting another. Why don't you blame Hitler, Kaiser Wilhelm, China today? Why don't you blame Kim Il-sung in June 25th of 1950 for invading South Korea? And my position is that's totally legitimate. Governments are the problem, not just the U.S. government today. Governments throughout history have been completely evil. The reason that I spend so much time criticizing the U.S. government is because this is the one government who claims that they can confiscate my income justly under the guise of protecting me. So when my own security service is claiming they protect me, and they're stealing from me, and they're provoking a conflict with someone else, whether that someone else is a good guy, a bad guy, or somewhere in between, this is the security service that has taken an oath to protect me. So I'm first and foremost going to criticize them relentlessly. So that would be just something that comes to mind with a lot of listeners where they go, why are you pinning everything on the U.S. government? Because they're the ones who confiscate my income, our incomes annually, under the guise of protecting us. So they need to step up their game.
Excellent. Let me ask you, how do we transition into a more voluntarist society?
You know, that I've spent a lot of time thinking about that, and I think Edward Stringham's book, Private Governance, was probably, let me give two answers. One is Murray Rothbard's Strategy for Liberty. I believe he wrote this in 92, I want to say, where he said, the way that we spread our ideas is by embracing the concept of populism. You tell the people, there are good guys and there are bad guys. The good people are the productive people who engage in voluntary exchanges, regardless of race or class. And the bad guys are people, regardless of race or class, who achieve their ends violently in the world. This includes almost all politicians, and it includes a lot of people who don't have political power but are murderers, rapists, thieves, kidnappers, fraudsters, etc. That is the divide in society, and we should relentlessly focus on the fact that we are getting ripped off. You represent us. Government gets their rights from the people. Okay, did I ever have the right to go around and issue taxes on people's income? If you get your rights from me, and I never had that right, how did I delegate that right to you in the first place? Government gets $6.27 trillion every single year, and they're worried that other people might have income that's untaxed. If anyone in society is the villain, if anyone's ripping us off, it's the political class and their co-conspirators. So by creating a true good guy, bad guy narrative within the mind of the average person, that's one way. The second way is exactly what Edward Stringham did, which is advocate the privatization of security. That is the state's core function. And once we just stop relying on them for things like that, once we see that PayPal, Venmo, credit unions, even private banks have a built-in incentive to protect our property and our person more so than any state, which gets our money involuntarily, whether they provide a really good service or a really bad service. Once we start privatizing security just through the process of spending our money on private security, that will increase the amount of social status and power private security firms have and will decrease people's general reliance on a state apparatus to achieve their ends.
Beautiful. Two things. One, the good guy, bad guy populist strategy reminds me a lot of the Hassan Piker strategy, just with different details and perspectives. Yeah, what do you think about that?
I think it's totally right. The difference is we have genuine good guys and genuine bad guys.
Yeah.
He picks them arbitrarily based on income. He doesn't differentiate between people who gain wealth as a result of voluntary exchange and meeting consumer demand and people who just steal it or use threats thereof. This is what Mises in Human Action referred to as pre-capitalist inequality. He said, it could be true that the wealthy are evil for a large percentage of history, because the way you gained wealth was through confiscation, imperialism, threats thereof. But under capitalism and the freedom of contract made it so you could acquire large amounts of wealth through the process of contracts and voluntary exchange.
Yeah.
So we could say, Hassan Piker, you're absolutely right. For 99% of history, rich equaled evil. That does not apply within the realm of capitalism, no, and that's why you should advocate capitalism. So yeah, it's similar in the wording that Hassan Piker uses, but we have legitimate bad guys. He has an unjustifiable framework.
Yeah, so our institute, the Menger Institute, we were just at lunch, and we thought of this beautiful analogy that's like, if we're at a table and we're all eating, 6 of us, if there's a fixed amount of food and I take more, that makes me look greedy. And then people could say, oh, you're evil, you're selfish, you're taking more food. But what we don't see is that there's a kitchen and they're producing more food and we're gonna have more food on the table. So just because I have more food doesn't mean you're any worse off. Actually, we're gonna have more food and we're all gonna be able to eat more. And that's kind of the idea of capitalistic prosperity, is that just because I have more wealth, I'm living with a phone, AC, a bigger home, a car, all these amenities, doesn't mean you necessarily have to be worse off. It's not a fixed pie. It's like the pie's growing or you're adding more toppings. It's 3-dimensional, not 2-dimensional. And also to complement what you're saying about private security as this transition is also when we have the separation of state and money production, then that can't fund the government's monopoly on security provision. And I think we're really actually closer to private societies and voluntarist societies than we really think.
Oh yeah, I think it'll be so gradual, people will not even realize that it's happening, and libertarians will never get credit for it.
Yeah.
They'll just be like, oh yeah, this is what I've always advocated. I never believed. When I said government, I just meant people should get together and achieve things cooperatively. That's how the average person defines it. So
yes.
If you're watching, if you think there's going to be Victory Day and we're going to have some big anarcho-capitalist celebration, we're never going to get credit for it, but our ideas will come to fruition, almost certainly.
Some trophies that will not be produced. And it reminds me of Isaiah's Job, written by Albert J. Nock, I believe. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
which is about discovering the remnant within society. So you want to plant as many seeds as possible. You don't want to say, well, is it going to rain in this area? Should I plant the seed? Let me spend a dozen hours looking at the soil. Plant as many seeds as possible. You don't know in advance which ones are going to grow up to be great big trees. So just from what I extract from that is spread the message of social cooperation and voluntarism far and wide, and that's how we will hopefully change things in the future. But what you said, cryptocurrency is so difficult for me to understand. I had Roger Ver and Steve Patterson on my show to discuss their book, Hijacking Bitcoin. I thought they've done great work in the area. The fact that there's private currencies, the more, the better. I would absolutely love for private currency to take hold. That would be a vitally important aspect of taking away the state's monopoly on the currency. Very good point there.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's still more evolutions to come beyond just cryptocurrencies. I don't know what they will be. But also I want to give credit to Stefan Kinsella for putting me on to Isaiah's job. But
Stefan Kinsella, I called him in 2014, 12 years ago. Oh my gosh. And I told him, hey, I'm trying to go to law school. I know you're an IP lawyer. Do you have any advice for me? And he just completely talked me out of it. He explained how difficult it was and how tedious it might be. And I said, gosh, this guy is so smart. Let me ask him. And I said, hey, if there is one book that you would recommend for me to read that would give me just a better understanding of economics or the world in general, don't give me 10. If you give me 10, I'll read 0. Give me 1. And he thought about it. He threw out a few ideas and said, all right, if I had to pick one, it would be A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism by Hans Hoppe. I read that book and I need to reread it because I am so grateful that that's where I got the definitions that I use in the video we spoke about earlier, just because those are the most consistent definitions. It's not just socialism is the state monopolizing the factors of production. So a country is no more socialist whether it taxes 1% of your income or 98%, so long as the factors of production are privately owned. What if they're heavily regulated? Hans Hoppe addresses that with his consistent definition, so I'm very thankful to Kinsella as well. Yeah. Thank you, Stefan.
That book, I remember I read that and it hit me like a train. I know exactly where I was when I was reading it, especially the chapter on conservative socialism, which you think are almost like a contradiction in terms. How can conservatives be socialists or capitalists? No. Conservatives are most certainly, in certain ways, they can be socialists. And that really opened my mind and blew my mind. Beautiful book. Yeah.
Yes, and I love his analysis of empiricism, where he says it's so difficult to find to do a controlled experiment and say, is capitalism or socialism better at increasing your living standards? Because anytime socialism gives you a negative result, you could say, oh, that wasn't a problem of a lack of private property or a lack of freedom to contract. That was the problem of Fidel Castro or Vladimir Lenin or Joseph Stalin or Nikita Khrushchev or Pol Pot or Ho Chi Minh. Or actually the U.S. was involved in the background and the British Empire had colonized the place beforehand. You can come up with a never-ending list of excuses, but until you engage the praxeological approach of socialism increases the amount of hurdles between producers and consumers. It rewards non-producers and producers equally. It rewards contractors and non-contractors equally. So when you keep raising the cost of being a producer and a contractor and a homesteader, you're going to get less production, less contracting, and less homesteading, and that's going to make your society poorer than it otherwise would be. That was just such an important aspect of Hans Hoppe's research. So yeah, that's a terrific book.
Yeah, I do want to read his, The Theory of Private Property, or the Ethics of Private Property?
Economics and Ethics of Private Property. That is a collection of essays where he discusses Marxist and Austrian class analysis. So he basically says that Karl Marx is right. There is a parasitic group in society. Oh, gosh. So he just takes Marx's historical and economic worldview and says, this is absolutely correct. Marx just inaccurately identified who the victim and who the aggressor were. It's not the proletariat. The victims are the productive people in society, and the exploiters are those who acquire property without engaging in voluntary exchanges. So he takes something, it's very important, because if our response to anyone who advocates any degree of socialism or Marxism is, you're a complete useful idiot, you're wrong on economics, you don't know what you're talking about, I think it's a little more productive and frankly friendly to say, you're totally right with your overall analysis, we just disagree on who the exploiters actually are. Someone offering you a voluntary employment contract, that's not exploitation. Because what's worse, you offer me a bad deal. Let's say you offer me $1 an hour is what you're going to hire me for. Well, if these people are offering me no job for $0 an hour, well, then that's actually worse. And I shouldn't see you as an exploiter. I should see you as someone who's giving me an opportunity to get my foot in the door. And then maybe I could go to one of your competitors and work there in the future. So his analysis of what it means to engage in exploitation in the economic sense is very important in the economics and ethics of private property.
Why do socialists see this as exploitation regardless of the alternative options? Even if I'm paying you, I'm giving you a job, they're saying, no. Because you're selling it, you're a capitalist, you're taking the profits, then I'm not getting the value that I produced as the laborer. And therefore, this is exploitation.
Yeah, two things. So they assume surplus value is something that should be opposed regardless of the level of voluntarism. So if you are a stay-at-home wife or a stay-at-home mom, technically you are exploiting the surplus value of your husband. Now, we don't think that because it's a voluntary arrangement, they can do whatever the hell they want. But according to this theory, if a portion of the worker's wages are siphoned, whether they're siphoned voluntarily by his choice or done coercively by the government, it's still siphoning off. It doesn't matter that there's a voluntary contract. It's literally like saying college should be illegal because people go there and they work 5 hours a day, 5 days a week, and they don't get paid. So their labor is being exploited, and the professor's benefiting. So in that case, the professor would be the exploiter. Yeah. This would also mean, of course, the government income tax is economic exploitation because they're siphoning off a portion of the worker's wages. This would mean all internships should be illegal because that's a person working for free at the benefit of someone else. All volunteer work by this metric would have to be outlawed because other people are benefiting from my labor and the surplus value that I've created. So thank God they don't actually believe it and they only use it as a justification to increase their power and influence. The other thing is they don't appreciate the value of the capitalist. Coming up with the idea of what to sell. That alone is so vitally important. Imagine going to Shark Tank and you say, investors, I'm looking for you to invest $1 million in my new company. And at our company, we have 1,000 workers. Now, I don't know what the idea is for the company, but we already have the 1,000 workers. And since the workers create all the value, you don't need an idea or just come up with one. It's really easy.
The value's there already.
Yeah, or is it actually the idea is damn near everything? And it's so hard to come across these ideas that very few people can come up with them. And the very few that do end up engaging in capital acts between consenting adults, which allow them to get the investment to bring these ideas to the marketplace for the consuming masses. So they come up with the idea of what to sell. They come up with the idea of how to sell it. Am I going to use gold, silver, copper, tin, aluminum? Where am I going to do it? Taiwan, Arizona, Argentina, Beijing? These are extremely difficult. Who are we going to hire? How are we going to train them? Should we hire 5 people or 1,000 people? Should they be using machines or tools, or should they do it by hand? This is all so complex. Where are we going to sell the items? How much are we going to sell them for? How much are we going to invest? How are we going to market the product? The socialist doesn't see any value in all of these critical attributions of how companies become profitable to give the workers their salary in the first place, and then to give those workers money, which has value in an economy with other products and services. The final thing, so this is what Jürgen Baumbacher discussed in his book, Capital and Interest. He says, all right, let's assume, or I'm just going to make the analogy that I've come up with. I've extracted this from Baumbacher's Capital and Interest. All right, 30 workers are just hanging out. Just talking about how evil the bourgeoisie are and how how easy it is to come up with the ideas of Apple and Amazon. Anyone could come up with those ideas. They're very simple. And they come across a lot that has abandoned property. There's a sign that says, former capitalist, now retired, take all this property, I relinquish my right to it. And it's all this property, and it's the building materials for an apartment complex. And there's all these blueprints. So all the property has been acquired and given to the workers for free. And the idea of what they're going to do is in the blueprints. They have the idea and they have the property. You might think, well, now you don't need a capitalist. Bombaverick says, well, actually, not so fast. How long is it going to take these 30 guys to get to work? How long is it going to take them to pass the state building inspection codes? How long is it going to take them to market their apartment complex? How long is it going to take them to get people moved in? How long is it going to take them to get the people who moved in to pay the first month's rent? Maybe they're delinquent. Second, third, fourth, fifth. It's going to take maybe a decade before this complex becomes profitable. Do all these 30 workers want to wait a decade before they start getting money? Or would you like there to be a financier, capitalist, or an investor that gives you money in the present in a shorter time frame, which allows them to take the risk? Maybe people are going to drive by and say, oh, the Carl Menger apartment complex, I never want to live there. And they might not live there. It might get burned down. It might attract people who are very uncivilized, and they might trash the place. So there's a ton of monetary risk on the profit side that the capitalist is taking, and the capitalist is giving the workers access to property, money, in a shorter time frame than if they would have had to wait longer. So the surplus value is another word for a price the worker concedes in order to get money in the present and to get it for sure. They're definitely getting X number of hours per dollar that they work, as opposed to maybe this product will sell a little or medium amount or a lot. I don't want that headache. I want to know that I'm getting the money. That is what the capitalist discount rate, if you want to call that, that's what that could be. So they don't understand the value of the capitalist, and they erroneously assume surplus value is something that only exists between employer and employee. That's why they're wrong about capitalism.
Yeah, fantastic analogy. And I think I'm all for voluntary exploitation, because once you realize subjective values, subjective preferences, as well as time preference, that if I pay you $1 million to dig a hole for me and then to fill it with a tree, who's exploiting who?
Yeah.
Maybe that the price of that marginal price of that labor would be like a couple $100, let's say. Well, okay, then you have a good deal. And many people would take that opportunity. So this idea of voluntary exploitation is so stupid in a sense, for lack of better words.
Yeah, I took a woman out to dinner the other night, and I paid for it. So she's exploiting me. She benefited from my surplus value.
Yeah.
The socialists, go get her. Go put her in the gulag, please. She benefited from my labor.
Yeah.
Or you could not be a psycho and see it as a voluntary exchange.
I mean, I do like to entertain the idea of, like, you take a stripper or a prostitute, and she's satisfying a service, a need or a desire of a man for this gratification. Who's exploiting who? She's making money. Is therefore she not the exploiter?
Yeah.
If she was selling, let's say, what is a need in this sense? So, yeah.
Yeah, she's using her scarce factors of production in order to acquire a significant amount of this man's labor,
Yes.
which is reflective in his money. Yeah, really. Well, who would they say? Because they would have to say that the prostitute is getting exploited in that situation, but also the man would be in a more vulnerable position because he'd have less economic and societal power. I think the socialists would just say it's the society that put them in that situation in the first place. And I don't think they'd say one is the aggressor and one is the victim.
Well, and also the gender sexist lens would have to always say that the woman is the oppressed victim and the man is the aggressive exploiter. Mm-hmm. Therefore, we need to change this human nature. Dynamics.
Yes, unfortunately, I apologize for the exploitation I caused Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris and Condoleezza Rice and Victoria Nuland. I'm very sorry about that. Please forgive me.
Keith, this was a pleasure. Is there anything else you would like to say?
Anything else? One aspect of the Democratic Socialist video that Matt mentioned earlier.
That is 4 hours.
It is
Not 3.
4 hours. Thank you very much. One of the things that I focus on in the book Domestic Imperialism and in the video that I think is overlooked by a lot of economists is at the core of democratic socialism, which Mamdani defines as bringing the ballot box into your everyday life, is if the workers are to own the factors of production, there is a very plausible explanation why the workers themselves might not want this, and that's because the gift of diversification. So if I work for the Carl Menger company, it doesn't make sense that I would also want to own stock in Carl Menger, because if we go under, I lose my job and all of my investments. So what I would want to do is work at the Carl Menger company, but I'd want to invest in the Mises Institute and the Libertarian Institute and maybe Reason Magazine and Apple and Walmart and Target. The only way you could literally do that is if there are private ownership, and if there is private ownership in the factors of production, where there's a stock market where I could buy portions of companies that I do not work for. The socialist has completely overlooked the concept of not wanting to put all your eggs in one basket. So I think that's one of the original contributions that I made in this. I had not heard that. Maybe everyone else has thought of it and just never told me, but I think that is one of the important contributions that I make in the video. So people could check that out and share it. I'd greatly appreciate it. Probably 15 years of economic research in 4 hours.
And to complement that point, that a democratic society, a society governed by the people versus like a republic of a society governed of the people, a government of the people, is that it creates more stress and anxiety for people who are managing, being forced to manage, looking out what they have to vote for. It's very stressful, and maybe that contributes to a lot of the stress and anxiety we see in society. And I'm sure we can probably do another hour discussing those ideas alone. But Keith, thank you very much. Where can people find you?
Libertarianinstitute.org.
Excellent. And we'll link your books. It was a pleasure.
Thanks so much, Matt.
Awesome.